welcome our first storyteller, Robin Bady. Thank you.
Another round of applause. You are a wonderful hostess. Thank you. Well, I'm second generation. I've been American. My grandparents were the ones who came here. On one side, they came from Romania. On the other side, they came from Russia. Now, my Romanian family, I know nothing about because they never talked about where they came from. When they got here, they were just so grateful to be here, to make a living, and to push ahead in their lives. They just did not want to talk about where they came from. But on my father's side of the family, the Russian side of the family, I had a great uncle, and I learned my immigration story, my family's immigration story, from his diary. And this goes back to 1904. So my dad's side of the family comes from a little town called Tolochkin, which is in Belarus, which used to be Russia, which used to be Poland, and which used to be God knows what, because it was in an area that was, whoever was, in charge, they just kept switching nationalities. They lived in the Pale of Settlement, which was the area where Jews were forced to live in Russia, Imperial Russia. They could not live or work outside this area. Now, we've all seen Fiddler on the Roof, and it wasn't quite like that. People were poor, people were unhappy, people loved their families, people worked really hard, work disappeared just like that. There were edicts against working at a certain job, borrowing money, making money, collecting your money, sending money, having money. And of course, there were the pogroms, which, interestingly enough, I read in my great uncle's book. I hear about pogroms, but rape, murder, burning down villages, and they would come every so often. It was state-sanctioned violence of a kind we Americans know nothing about. Or do we? So anyway, my great uncle Harry wrote the book. And he was the kind of guy who liked to talk. And he liked to talk about what he believed. And he was a socialist and a Zionist. And sometimes after work, if he had work, and during the day, if he didn't have work, he would just go to the town square and stand on a box and start talking about the importance of socialism, the importance of Zionism, and the importance, and this was really unusual, of Christians and Jews working together. We were Jews. Well, every so often the police would come and they'd pull him off and they'd beat him up. They'd kick him in the head, they'd kick him in the face. They'd break his nose, they'd try to break one of his ribs. Sometimes they left him alone. You never sort of knew, but he just kept going because he believed in this. He believed in the power of the word and the power of the connection. So one time when Great Uncle Harry, or Herschel, which was his Jewish name, he went and he talked, no police. But when he got home, he saw his father being dragged out of the home and chains being put on him by the police chief. Well, Harry not only liked to talk, but he had a temper. So he went up to that police chief and he punched him in the face. And the police chief fell back, and then he punched him again and broke his nose, and he fell on the ground. And then he grabbed my grandfather, a great-grandfather, and he pulled him into the home, and he locked the door. And much as the police banged on the door, he wouldn't let them in. Well, then he had all of his siblings come. There were 10 in the family. My grandfather was the oldest. And they talked about what should happen now. Because now that he'd punched out the police chief, it was pretty obvious that it was dangerous for him to stay in town. And so they made a plan that night. And all the sisters and brothers brought everything that they could spare. The women brought jewelry, the men brought watches. Anyone who had money brought that, and they'd put it in a big bag. And then they decided that my grandfather should go with him because Harry, being such a hothead, he shouldn't go alone. The next morning, they set off. And they went to a man that was going to book them a passage, would get them past the border of Russia into Germany, and then get them over to where the boat was, where they would already have passage to sail to America. Because that was the dream for each one of them. All of these people in their town, in the Pale of Settlement, they wanted to go to America. They wanted to go where the land was paved with gold. So, Grandpa and Great Uncle Harry handed over what it was, I think it was 110 rubles, which in today's money would be $1.66. He handed them over to them, and they got on a train. And I actually had to bring this because this went on for a long time. They got on a train, and then they got on, when they got off the train, they got in 3 carts. There were 3 carts waiting at the train station, all filled with Jews. They got in, and then they went to another town. And when they got out of the cart at the town, they went to an inn, they washed their faces, they ate a little bit of something, and then they got into another cart, and they were taken to another part of town. And then they got into another cart, and it was getting dark, and they were taken to the woods. And in the woods, they were told to lie down and be quiet. And that's where they stayed. Until some Christians came and told them to get up and walked them over to the border. And they walked past the guards. The Russian guards must have been paid off. But they didn't stop them. They went across the border, and they thought they were free, and they were ready to go. And all the guys it was mostly men. It was a caravan of them. There were so many. They just broke into song, and most of them being rather political. At this time, 1900s, if you were poor, you were political. If you were Jewish, you were political, unless you were religious. And most of these guys were not religious. They wanted to get out, and they wanted to find a new world. Well, they broke into song, and they sang their way until they got to an inn where they were given something to eat and then shown a barn where they were to sleep. And they slept in that barn for about 5 days and 5 nights. And then they got up again, and they got on a horse and buggy, and they were taken to another place, and they were taken to a train, and then they took the train to a place where they had to walk into a town, and the town was Hamburg. Big building. They went in. One by one, the doctors examined. There must have been at least 100 men. Examined each one of them, and then they were sent into the showers, and they had to take all their clothes off and wash themselves while another doctor examined them. And then the ones who were examined and found fine were sent on their way to another building, and the rest of them were sent back. So my grandfather and my great uncle went to the second building, and there they were to wait for the news that they were to sail. So they waited 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And then my grandfather got up and said, "What's going on here? How come we haven't been given our boat yet?" And that's when they found out that they'd been cheated, that their money had all been taken, and they couldn't get onto a boat to go to America. Well, they didn't know what to do, so they left outside, and both of them just burst into tears. And that's when, and I just love how it's written in this book, a very kind Christian gentleman came and said, what's the matter? And when they explained, he goes, "I'll take care of it." He gave them enough money for their passage as well as food. And the very next day, my grandfather and my great uncle sailed to America. And when they got there, it took a long time to settle. There wasn't much work. There was still lots of anti-Semitism. It was still hard. But they sent whatever money they could back to repay their brothers and sisters and their father and mother. And then one by one, they brought them. Today you call it chain migration. Then they called it bringing the family. It was one after another, brought all 10 brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, children, and finally, my great-grandmother had passed away by then, they brought their father, Moshe. And that's how my family came to America.